Hello, I'm Sarah O. Lamb, Senior Fellow of the Technology Policy Institute. Today, our panel is the second of 6 in the TPI Winter Spectrum Series. We have joining us Traci Biswese, Vice President and Associate General Counsel of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, Doug Brake, Assistant Vice President of Policy Communications at CTIA, the Wireless Association, Michael Calabrese, Director of the Wireless Future Program at the Open Technology Institute at New America, Monica Desai, founder of Tech Policy Advisors, LLC, and Christian Stout, Director of Innovation Policy of the International Center for Law and Economics. At the first webinar of the series that took place last week, we had a panel of economists who discussed the process of valuing different band allocations. This week, we'll get more into the nitty-gritty about use cases and industry needs for different types of spectrum bands. Before we get into a fun debate, I just wanted to also highlight that there's a spectrum hearing tomorrow morning that I'll be watching, hosted by Senate Commerce. And there's a new Spectrum Pipeline Act of 2025 introduced last month in the House with provisions for flexible use, unlicensed spectrum, and auction authority. So with all these teed up, my first question for our panel is, what new spectrum do you think we need for these new uses? People are connecting now by Wi-Fi, fixed wireless, mobile, satellite, in their cars, with wearables. So what is coming in innovation in your mind? What are specific use cases that you think we need more spectrum for? And why is that spectrum that you think we need more of not enough in the current allocation table? So I'll start with Monica. I think you're ready.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you for having me on the panel. I really appreciate it. As your question reflects, there are a range of ways to connect, definitely. And you asked us to come with prepared with some statistics if possible. And so I think statistics will help inform the answer, some of the thought process behind, what we need going forward. The statistics reflect that Wi-Fi carries a disproportionate amount of the traffic we see by far. So to underscore this, Wi-Fi already carries up to 90% of all US mobile traffic across wireless carriers, 80 to 90% of US internet traffic, and more than half of all global traffic. And in the case of cable households, which Traci may speak to, their percentage is even higher. 90% of cable operators' mobile data in the US is carried over Wi-Fi. And even for mobile carriers, as Doug knows, a significant proportion of their customer smartphone traffic is carried by Wi-Fi, at least for one mobile carrier, as high as 87%. So, and this all makes sense as we spend the majority of our time connecting to the internet and most of our data intensive devices and applications indoors, at our homes, our offices, and schools. So, they're all these devices are programmed to connect to Wi-Fi. So then let's go back to your question. What do our industries, need in order to compete and to thrive and to innovate going forward? And as a foundation, our industries need infrastructure, especially spectrum infrastructure. The next generations, a generation and generations to come of innovative devices and services, as your question reflects, need high bandwidth, low latency, low power consumption connectivity, and they need enough of it. And given the increasingly important value of Wi-Fi, both societal, both social and economic, and I didn't even speak to the economic stats yet, it's critical to ensure there's a sufficient supply of Wi-Fi spectrum for use going forward.
Great. And maybe to provide a counterpoint, Doug, do you want to go next? So
sure, yeah. I mean, happy to talk about our thoughts on the spectrum that we need to fuel the use cases of the future. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned, I'm Doug Brake with CTIA, the Wireless Association. We represent the mobile operators and mobile industry broadly in the United States. And so when you're talking about use cases, I think we're really talking about kind of demand. And we see wireless data traffic on wide area mobile networks. So setting aside any question about how much flows over Wi-Fi or mobile, but the demand on just the mobile networks alone continues to skyrocket. Last year, again, we saw the largest increase in mobile traffic, 36% higher than the year before, nearly double the amount of data just 2 years prior. We expect to see that grow 3 times again by 2029. So there are all sorts of interesting use cases that are driving that demand for mobile data using licensed spectrum. And we see connected cars, advanced manufacturing are 2 big ones. Augmented reality is a key growing use case, seeing adoption across industries. Smart cities are a good example, where the wide coverage of full power spectrum is critical, can unlock tremendous efficiency gains. I think there's a lot of excitement and interest around the growth of AI, of course, and there's a real anticipation of growth of AI mobile data traffic. And I think we're already seeing some initial concerns about whether or not we have adequate spectrum resources to provide the capacity needed for AI mobile traffic, particularly in the upload. AI, we still don't know quite, the exact architecture of what that traffic will look like, but it's anticipated that there'll be significant amounts of either, video or picture uploads right to cloud processing for AI in the cloud. And so there's going to be significantly more upload traffic than maybe was previously anticipated with other architectures, if that makes sense. We're seeing initial research estimating AI data traffic will boost uplink traffic up to 35% higher than it would be otherwise. Another really important, I think, 5G use case is, of course, fixed wireless. People finally have a choice in the broadband provider and are now leaving cable in droves. For the last 3 years, we saw 99%, virtually all of net new broadband subscribers are choosing 5G fixed wireless. Mobile operators can only offer the service where they have sufficient spectrum to manage capacity. One operator already announced that they have a wait list over 1 million households long. So I think we talk about like a real spectrum bottleneck holding back real gains to public policy. Talking about broadband competition that policymakers have been working for decades. If we're able to allocate more spectrum, more mid-band spectrum for licensed use, we're able to unlock this capacity. Researchers estimated consumers could save $8.1 billion annually if mobile had sufficient spectrum to offer the service more broadly. So I think, to my mind, those are some of the key use cases. When you talk about actual spectrum needed, our estimates indicate that we really need about 400 megahertz of more mid-band licensed spectrum in order to keep up with this growth in demand by 2027. And that grows to over 1400 megahertz by 2032. So yeah, happy to get into more details around those numbers, but that's our perspective. Thank you.
Great. And then I guess going up into space, I think, Michael, you can talk a little bit about satellite. So how is satellite changing, the traditional mobile and home use licensed, like unlicensed? Is satellite just like another dimension here?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. No, that's right. I mean, we actually need, when you think of what we need in our networks going forward, it's really, I think, a balanced policy with more spectrum for mobile, but also for Wi-Fi, for private networks. And now increasingly going forward, I think you'll see a surge in the need for satellite spectrum as well. So all 4 of those modes of connectivity are what I believe will really make a world-leading 6G ecosystem, because it's really a wireless ecosystem that's most important and not just another G in a silo that's maybe faster or has higher capacity by itself. So in the satellite realm, these constellations of low Earth orbit satellites, LEOsats, are, we see Starlink, of course, but others are on their way. Kuiper, and then there's also others like Globalstar, Iridium, and so on that are in business. And what they'll be able to do is really to sort of fill out the connectivity ecosystem by offering connectivity everywhere. And we've seen that in two flavors, so far, which are emerging. And I think it's an important distinction. One is what the FCC authorized last year, supplemental connectivity from space, where a LEO satellite operator partners with a mobile carrier to use the mobile carrier, the cellular spectrum, to connect, to allow for texting now, maybe more later, in areas where there's no terrestrial coverage or the signal is very weak. But there's a different flavor of that, which is going to be very exciting, I think, not just for connecting consumers, but for enterprise IoT and a whole wide range of use cases as well, which is direct to device, where, for example, mobile satellite spectrum is used to connect directly to devices. So what we see on the market currently is on the new iPhone, Globalstar allows you to do two-way texting anywhere basically anywhere in the world, but certainly anywhere in our country, whether you're in the middle of the Mojave Desert, up on a mountain, because it's direct back and forth to the satellite. But there's very little spectrum for that purpose. So one of the things we're looking at, for example, in the upper C-band, the FCC is just releasing a notice of inquiry about what would be the highest and best use for another 200 megahertz roughly of the upper C-band. And part of that might be it's contiguous to the C-band that was auctioned recently for mobile carriers, but part of it, I would say in the upper part, might really enhance mobile satellite spectrum, because there's not nearly enough of that, and it's needed in the low mid-band in order to do all these not only enhanced connectivity and competition for consumer devices, but all sorts of the whole wide range of enterprise IoT platforms, uh, in motion, um, sensing networks, and so on. So anyway, I'd love to say more about the other three flavors of connectivity we need spectrum for as well. But since you asked about satellite, that's something that's going to be up and coming as a hot topic.
Great. And I think that demarcation, like inside the home, inside buildings versus mobility outside the home, is an interesting way to think about different benefits of spectrum delivery. Traci, can you help us understand more like how important in the home is, what that looks like?
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to you all for having me here again. I'm Traci Biswese with NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, and with a principal trade association for the U.S. cable industry. And looking forward to telling you about indoor use cases. So as Monica mentioned already, Wi-Fi is and certainly will remain the workhorse of consumer connectivity. We recently saw just last week at Cable Labs put out a blog on Wi-Fi exhaustion, and it's expected that Wi-Fi spectrum exhaust is expected to first be seen in densely populated environments due to continued growth in connected devices and increasingly data intensive and latency sensitive applications. And certainly additional unlicensed Wi-Fi spectrum will be critical to the continued innovation and next generation devices and applications in education, healthcare, and entertainment. And even, when we look at connectivity like fixed wireless, we know that on the other side of that, although it may be, 5G to the home, once it's connecting to the IoT devices within the home, those are on Wi-Fi chipsets. And so Wi-Fi is still the technology that's connecting the devices that consumers are using indoors. and not only in homes, but also as I mentioned, hospitals, schools, libraries, and so forth. So that's just a piece of it. And just kind of to zoom out a little, industries today certainly require flexible and forward-looking spectrum policy that supports both unlicensed access and shared spectrum access frameworks to drive innovation and economic growth. Unlicensed spectrum, and particularly Wi-Fi, has been critical for innovation, as we've seen from research just recently out by Dr. Raul Katz in a report on assessing the economic value of Wi-Fi. This indicates that Wi-Fi networks now handle upwards of 90% of mobile data traffic, and Monica went through some of those statistics. And this vast capacity is essential to the proliferation of connected devices across multiple sectors, not a single industry. And let's consider the realm of telemedicine, since I mentioned that already, and remote healthcare. So with the growing need for real-time diagnostics and remote patient monitoring and even telesurgery, high bandwidth and low latency connectivity is no longer just a luxury, it's an absolute necessity. Wi-Fi's role in these settings is paramount. To improve emergency responses and rapid data transmission, and also to support advanced medical imaging and various techniques there. These capabilities directly lead to improved patient outcomes, reduce cost, and these lead to economic and social benefits. Another key example I'd like to point out is in the manufacturing sector, as industrial IoT solutions become integral to smart factory operations, the need for reliable and high-speed connectivity is certainly growing rapidly, and advanced sensors, robotics, and augmented reality systems used for quality control and process optimization will depend on robust unlicensed spectrum solutions, as we found out from the ABI's research and white paper on the future of spectrum allocation, which emphasizes that emerging tech such as next generation IoT will continue to push the boundaries of what Wi-Fi networks can support. And this further underscores the importance of expanding unlicensed Wi-Fi spectrum while effectively also leveraging shared spectrum access frameworks. And to put another finer point on this, it's also important to note that the 5G that we often talk about, and in future generations, is not synonymous with an exclusive spectrum access models. We like to look at shared access frameworks that are already supporting advanced 5G use cases that also happen indoors to some extent, as we talk about kind of manufacturing factories and so forth. These are used by everyone from big wireless carriers to industrial campuses, airports, and other innovators. And our industry leaders, NCTA's members, are prime examples, not only expanding their broadband footprint, but also deploying innovative and shared spectrum solutions to support private network deployments and competitive new entrants in the mobile wireless space. So by combining open innovation and unlicensed Wi-Fi with shared spectrum arrangements, we're creating a dynamic ecosystem that benefits all users.
Great. And Christian, I guess if you could weigh in, you're not really in one industry or another, but coming from kind of a more neutral place. If you were to decide, which use case gets more spectrum or is more important, how would you make that decision?
Give everybody exactly what they're asking for, because both licensed, unlicensed, satellite, all of them are providing a tremendous amount of value to the US and the world economy. It's hundreds of billions of dollars a year. I think all these different industries contribute to our economy. So it's a difficult problem, because the arguments for more licensed and the arguments for more unlicensed and the arguments for satellite all make very good sense when they're put on the table, because obviously to anybody who has a cell phone, when you're out and you have a good connection, that's great. I happen to live in a cell phone dead spot for some reason. My town, you can't get good coverage. I'm in New Jersey. It's like one of the most densely populated areas. And so it always reminds me how much I depend on my cell phone. At the same time, Wi-Fi is such an important technology for not just internet connectivity, but for allowing innovators and entrepreneurs the freedom to experiment with different kinds of approaches to deploying technologies that we don't know about, right? So it gives room for these innovators to experiment. Satellite at the same time, as Michael said, is becoming increasingly important in the mix of technologies where, one of the main problems that we try to solve in the United States is how to close the digital divide. The problem there is the last 5 to 10%, depending on what numbers you look at, are persistently difficult and extremely expensive to connect. And I would love it if we could wire fiber everywhere, but there's some cases where even the fiber providers probably don't really want to go out there if they don't have to, because it costs so much money per mile to run that fiber. So something like satellite is going to be an extremely important component in helping connect those last but important few percentage points of people who are unconnected. So then how do you deal with these problems from my perspective? So frequently when I talk about these issues, nobody really loves what I say because I like wireless, I like Wi-Fi, and they all want me to say what they want, but I think they're all right. So I try to turn it around and to think about like, well, how do you approach the policy questions from a perspective like I have? And this might be a bias coming from doing a lot of antitrust work, but I tend to try to frame everything through a consumer lens, and both, business consumer and private consumer. What is it that will enhance consumer welfare when you're thinking about these questions? And when you frame it that way, I think what you increasingly see, as I think the story that the people who have spoken so far in this panel have told, is we're seeing a move towards something like a convergence from a consumer perspective, where the consumer is going to subscribe to AT&T or Comcast or whoever, and they're going to expect constant connection wherever they go. So I have an Apple iPhone, I'm on T-Mobile, I have Optimum at home. And then when Apple turned on the agreement for the text messaging with T-Mobile, I suddenly discovered that I have this extra feature when I'm in a place that's hard to connect. I now have text messaging there. I think consumers are going to demand more of this kind of a connectivity experience going forward, which means that I think there's going to be pressure on both unlicensed and licensed providers and satellite providers to come together and have business relationships with each other where they complement each other from a consumer's perspective, which means that only heightens the need for both licensed and unlicensed and getting that balance right. Because the consumer is going to look at this from the perspective of, I don't care whether it's a complete cell connection or it's a fiber connection or it's a satellite connection. I just want to be on the internet when I'm on the internet, which means that policy, I think, has to orient around that, and that you have to make sure that policymakers are sensitive to the need for both enough unlicensed and shared as well as licensed. And then, as Michael noted, once you start bringing satellite into this mix, we're going to have to be very careful to make sure that there's enough satellite spectrum available to do these supplemental use cases as well. So from that sort of neutral third-party perspective, how do you solve these problems? I think it's designing access to spectrum in a way that can be flexible and allows policymakers to sort of pivot when they see new use cases. When a particular spectrum band becomes obviously very useful for a particular kind of technology, enabling the FCC or whoever's administering the particular spectrum band to work with industry to figure out how to make sure that happens without creating a lot of roadblocks in that process. Technically, how you do that, we have to all talk about that and figure that out together.
Great. Yeah. So now that, we've laid out the cards, everyone has their corner. And I think, where it gets difficult is when the government or Congress has to actually allocate bands. And so we don't have someone from the government here. So there is government federal spectrum. And there's, a lot of discussion around the 3 gigahertz bands. How do you see the government as a player here? Do they have too much spectrum? Should they keep what they have? How are policymakers supposed to think about that? Maybe Doug.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to speak to that. When we think about government spectrum, I think I usually tend to think about it in terms of incentives, right? The federal government has a tremendous amount of spectrum. They have incredibly important public policy missions that they have to carry out using that spectrum. So absolutely, they need spectrum. They need a lot of spectrum. Their demands are growing, as our industries. I think the real question to my mind is, do they face an incentive to use that spectrum efficiently, right? And what we've seen over the process of several efforts to repurpose federal spectrum, I think it's fair to say that the answer is no, right? We have a lot of different varying use cases, varying assignments on the federal side that are sometimes mixed together, that we can sort those out, place like with like in order to have a more efficient repacking of spectrum. We can take equipment that was in some cases designed decades ago. For example, the AWACS platform, that's a major system in the lower 3 gigahertz band, that Air Force generals describe as being on hospice care right now, right? It's an end-of-life system that's being, they have to go to the old planes out of the boneyard in order to get parts for the current operations. And so are there systems like that where we're already looking to upgrade to, for example, the wedge tail platform that uses, where our allies use that system, different spectrum, right? Does it make sense to, when we're upgrading these systems, as it makes sense to do, as we need to do, to look towards a more efficient way of using the spectrum, of putting it together with similar services, and making this this overall system more efficient. And so I think we don't always naturally see the incentives on the government side that we do in the private sector, where our members are paying billions of dollars in order to access the right to use this spectrum. And you face real incentives to use it efficiently, to put it into use quickly. I know we also don't see those same incentives on the unlicensed side, where folks don't pay for spectrum, but that's a kind of a separate question. And so I think if we could get a spectrum pipeline, right, some legislation from Congress that identifies bands for a pipeline and reauthorizes the FCC's auction authority, that would be a real target, right? A real message of here's what we expect to achieve in the coming years. And it's going to take some work, right? It's going to take real engineers from the private sector and government getting together and figuring out how we can do this efficiently, where there are real opportunities to create real value, and then auction that spectrum off. I don't think it means that we need to completely clear these bands, right? There's this sort of false narrative out there that in order to do exclusive licenses, in order to auction licenses, we have to completely clear lower 3, right? That's never been something we've asked for. It's not something we expect. I think there are a lot of really important radars, particularly in the lower portion, the lower 400 megahertz of the lower 3 gigahertz band. And we're not expecting to clear all of those. But if we can have real engineer to engineer conversations that can unlock real efficiency gains, I think that's a win for everyone. And I think if you aren't interested in having those types of conversations and would rather leave all of those systems in place, no matter if they're efficient or not, I kind of question your motives for that kind of decision making, if that makes sense. I'll leave it at that.
Comments? Yeah, Monica, I think I see your hand.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's right to say that it doesn't have to be either or. But going back to what Christian had discussed, I think it's first important from an economic standpoint, to figure out, well, what allocations will best support our economy? What allocations are going to best support our future technological growth, our global competitiveness, and how are we going to best support current and future consumer expectations? What minimizes risk to national security and cost to the United States government? What technologies will most efficiently use the frequencies to deliver the most value to the US as a whole and to the American people as a whole? So I think the question of value is important to consider as we're making these decisions. It's economic impact, consumer value, and net gain to the United States government. And so another example of this would be, the 7 gigahertz band. We talked about Wi-Fi previously, and it's a great band as an opportunity for sharing and delivering greater economic value to the U.S. through Wi-Fi. It's already heavily used by mission critical federal incumbents like Department of Defense, like NASA, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, FAA. And unlicensed sharing in that band would enable the US government to potentially open up significant commercial and consumer value and bandwidth without incurring the high cost or complexity of relocating or clearing federal users, but keeping in mind what Doug said, like, it's not necessarily keeping outdated uses in place, but also keeping in mind that there are mission critical activities for the US government happening in that band, but there might be the opportunity as well to open up for higher value for the US economy as a whole.
Michael, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think, mention that we have a process and also a framework we can look at. So what Doug was describing is, largely correct, that that in these, where the National Spectrum Strategy is looking for more spectrum is primarily in two very large federal bands, which are also predominantly military, the lower 3 gigahertz, and also what Monica mentioned in the 7 gigahertz above what we have unlicensed today. And there is a process underway. That's what the National Spectrum Strategy started, a multi-stakeholder process that has a couple different tracks, and it is studying and planning to test, three different approaches to making this sort of spectrum available. In other words, to what degree can we, can the military in particular consolidate or change what they're doing to allow full power licenses, similar to what they did in the 3450 to 3550 band not long ago. Second, lower power licensing by rule. And third is in, very low power indoor only use. And so this is really, I think the reality of this is that it's going to be by, looking at subbands. In other words, there probably could be portions of those bands that are available for each of those. But we really don't have, the facts aren't in. This study needs to go forward. And in that respect, it's important to realize for, any of your viewers who don't know this, is that, there is a proven third way that's already in operation that allows you to, protect the incumbent use, because, it's highly unlikely, the Pentagon has said it's highly unlikely, particularly as we see in Ukraine, we're moving into an era of electronic and drone warfare, that they are going to be able to give up a whole lot of spectrum. But there is a way to protect incumbents while meeting a wide variety of use cases. And we see that with the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, which is in the middle of the 3 gigahertz band. It works around US Navy radar. So it's a little more straightforward because it's just the Navy, but it's licensed by rule access, and so this sort of it's 3-tier sharing, right? So it starts with the premise of protecting the Navy. It auctioned priority access licenses, which are at a lower power, smaller local license areas, of which Verizon was the largest buyer and is the biggest deployer, in fact, in the band. And there's also an overlay of general authorized access, which is open to anyone. And most of the more than 1,000 enterprises and operators using the band are using the GAA, and it's about 80% in rural areas. So that is a great framework to meet a wide variety of use cases, from private enterprise networks to targeted capacity for mobile carrier networks where they need it. That's how Verizon uses it, to fixed wireless in rural areas as well as for carriers. and more indoor connectivity for schools, airports, and other congested venues. And the Department of Defense has indicated that that's, much more likely what they can live with. And since that's working well in CBRS, we really need to consider if that isn't the best balance where you have, going back to what we said about how, the strongest 6G wireless ecosystem, if you think in terms of ecosystem, as Christian said, interoperability, ubiquity, seamless connectivity, that's going to involve all these different modes, Wi-Fi, shared, licensed, high power, low power, satellite. If I think that would really fit in better for that future.
Traci, you had your hand up, and then I'll make a comment.
Thanks so much. And so I just wanted to pick up on points made by both Michael and Doug. So, looking at legislation first, of course, NCTA supports renewed spectrum auction authority for the FCC, and we hope to see that in a way that is a clean legislation which allows NTIA and the FCC to do the jobs that they are expert at, and identifying bands, which, as Michael mentioned, there are already some bands identified under the National Spectrum Strategy, and doing studies there to understand, whether, to what extent that spectrum is being efficiently used. To Doug's point, we certainly, encourage and advocate for efficient use of spectrum. And, and also in addition to looking at efficiency of use in those spectrum bands, looking at the kind of technological characteristics of the bands, the propagation characteristics, to understand, what types of access models and what types of technologies work best for the specific bands that are under study. And then, of course, as NTIA goes through its study process, so along with the government agencies who are incumbents in the band, then leave it to the FCC to to undergo its process for getting stakeholder input to understand how best to actually decide to make that spectrum available commercially. And so I think those are all certainly important points. I think another thing to keep in mind, and something interesting that we're seeing, is this dynamic spectrum sharing models, which are a key innovation and part of the solution, and figuring out how to make use of a dwindling and kind of resource that's no longer widely available and open and clear. As we're seeing with NTIA's dynamic spectrum sharing, or DSS demonstration, this endeavors to pave the way for real-time multi-dimensional spectrum access. And ahead of time, you kind of asked us to think about kind of the bidding process and the concept of bidding on what use is more valuable. And this is certainly appealing, but traditional auctions certainly have their limitations. And while they're excellent at revealing market valuations for exclusive use, they struggle to capture the broader social benefits that dynamic, shared, and unlicensed models offer. Auctions of exclusive spectrum licenses were revolutionary and Nobel Prize worthy even, particularly when our priority was nationwide coverage. But today, as consumer demands have shifted toward densification and advanced applications like artificial intelligence and smart manufacturing, healthcare innovations, we need new ideas and innovation, and innovative spectrum access strategies. Dynamic spectrum sharing, real-time coordination, and flexible use policies are essential to meet the evolving needs of consumers and other spectrum beneficiaries.
Great. Yeah, so I think, we all agree we need more of all the types. But I wondered, what the panel thought. Well, why can't, and I mean, Christian, you said this too, why can't we have both? So, why can't we move faster and get exclusive use, the 400 megahertz that, the mobile wireless sector wants, and have the unlicensed model continue to go forward? Why, I feel like the frustrating thing is waiting, and the gridlock wastes time. So why can't there be both now, faster? And the CBRS model, it doesn't seem to be congested to me. So is CBRS being used well right now? If you need more unlicensed, why isn't CBRS being used more? Is it just a matter of time, like devices aren't being deployed, or like I haven't seen I haven't used CBRS yet, or like a device hasn't come to me. So what is the state of play there?
I mean, I think the statistics show there have been over 380,000 CBRS base stations deployed in the last 3 years alone, compared to 419,000 cell sites deployed in the entire 40-year history of the commercial wireless industry. And there's research studies that forecast that the US CBRS market will grow 280% and reach 66 million connections by 2028. So I think, it's there, it's growing, it's robust. But I think zooming out a bit and just touching on a point that Michael had made, I think there's some important lessons learned through CBRS, because it really showed a very impressive collaboration with the FCC, NTIA, DoD, and industry. So it shows from a big picture perspective how government commercial sharing can work while permitting innovation and competition. And it also shows that DoD is willing to share spectrum, and that the commercial industry can make use of the spectrum. So I think those are important points to keep in mind.
Traci, and then maybe Christian. Yeah, Christian, you want to go first, then Traci.
Sure. Traci, did you want to go first?
No, you first.
Okay. To the gridlock point, I think part of the problem, I'm going to blame it on Congress. I'll get to the bottom line. And I don't think it's out of anybody not wanting to solve this problem. I think it goes back to the theme of that's running through a lot of what we're discussing, that everybody understands that all of these uses are very important. And that I think industry, from all the different sides of this problem, make very good cases about why they need access to the spectrum they need. So when they go to Congress, I can only imagine that the staffers that try to help sift through these issues, they themselves feel it's like a choice paralysis and figuring out like, well, which one of these industries do I support in these arguments? Because in your daily life, you have clear experience with both licensed and unlicensed, and it's very obvious how valuable those are. So it's frustrating that we don't have consensus on how to move forward with new spectrum reauthorization. I would like to just see a deal at this point. I'd be like willing to take almost any deal just to get something going. I'm not in Congress and I don't work for any of the companies, so I can say that. But it's not surprising that it's having trouble moving forward. On the CBRS side, to your point, Sarah, I have not personally had any interaction with CBRS devices, but I know that there have been a lot deployed around the country. And I think that the story around CBRS is just because it's still considered a relatively new experiment. It's only been running for a few years, that there's still, I think, some trepidation from people who were not completely bought into CBRS about like, well, how effective will this really be? So I think there's still some of that anxiety around it, which to me, I think explains a little bit of why we're not pushing that CBRS model more broadly. I'm optimistic about it. I think the early results look really positive, but I understand the trepidation as well.
And so I just like to clarify that, CBRS, this is not unlicensed spectrum. This is licensed by rule. There are, a number of tiers as Michael walked through. And, as a consumer, we wouldn't necessarily see a CBRS device. CBRS is a way of deploying 5G, largely 5G technology. So we do have the benefit of CBRS in the places where it's been deployed. As extensions of our cellular service, certainly for cable providers who offer mobile phone service, they're their consumers are, beneficiaries of CBRS. Also, as I mentioned earlier about kind of the private networks, those private networks that have not only deployed for themselves with kind of companies like John Deere, but also where for instance larger carriers may deploy private networks for some of their customers. These are networks that are taking advantage of CBRS as well. So I just wanted to clarify that this is CBRS has been a success. NTIA has said so in reporting. Very recently we've already seen CBRS 2.0, which has added to the benefits and access to CBRS, and it's widely considered and agreed to be a successful model, innovative model for accessing spectrum by non-traditional spectrum users like kind of tribal areas and schools and libraries that are deploying their own college campuses and so forth. And then also I just wanted to touch on kind of Sarah's point or question: why can't we make spectrum available sooner? Why does it have to take so long? I think an interesting model that we've seen just last week is by United Kingdom's Ofcom. They released they opened a kind of consultant process where folks are able to weigh in, kind of a comment period on an idea for the use of the 6 gigahertz spectrum, where initially the first kind of step in this phase would be that Wi-Fi would be available and across the 6 gigahertz band, and folks can start deploying Wi-Fi access points immediately. And and once that deployment is out and folks have a chance to really take advantage and reap the benefits of 6 gigahertz unlicensed use like we have here in the United States, then at some point after some studies, there's a determination of whether there may also be some type of shared licensed or other type of 5G types of use of the band. So perhaps the Wi-Fi is indoor, and then they look at the kind of outdoor use cases. And I think there's certainly an appetite for a tiered access for some of the spectrum bands that are teed up in the National Spectrum Strategy, like 7 gigahertz, where we know that maybe looking at the lower 7 first for immediate availability for Wi-Fi and unlicensed technologies, and then taking some more time to study the upper bands as we consider kind of shared or other types of models, and similar for the 3.1 model, which is our 3.1 spectrum, which is on the table, perhaps making that available in a similar way fashion to CBRS, where maybe a general access is allowed at first, and then eventually there's some type of priority access that's auctioned off in some way once the kind of studies and the process at the FCC for figuring out the auction and auction authority is actually kind of is there and available, and then allowing additional access to that spectrum. So I do think that there are innovative ways that are already available to us where we can where we don't have to wait. We can make spectrum available now for consumers to reap the benefits.
Great. Doug, and then we have a question from the
Yeah,
audience.
sure. I don't know. There's a lot of ground covered since I've jumped back in, and I'm not going to be able to chase down every thread of little things that I might quibble with. But one thing that jumped out at me, Monica repeats the cable talking point that falsely compares the number of CBRS base stations to the cell sites of the mobile industry. This one, I don't know, has bugged me for a while. We have CBSDs, right, that are relatively small, cover a small area, and then there's this comparison made to cell sites on which there would be several different base stations, radio units. There would be point in different sectors, point in different directions for different operators using different spectrum. It's just like apples to hand grenades. It's a totally ridiculous comparison. If you're actually talking about radio units, mobile industry, those estimates are on order of magnitude larger, 7-8 million different radio units in the United States, and so it's a ridiculous comparison. And as Mike, if we're talking about CBRS, as Michael mentioned, mobile operators are major users, and so most of those CBSDs that we see deployed in CBRS are from major mobile operators. we're not seeing very much use in the band. I agree with Sarah that it's not congested, right? This isn't something where there's congestion that's holding back growth in these the types of use cases that legitimately, where Wi-Fi just isn't good enough, and they need CBRS. We're not seeing the congestion holding back those use cases. Our drive tests, in fact, showed less than 10% of CBRS in use in the 8 different cities where we performed drive tests. Compare that to C-band, where we saw over 90% in use, and that's even over a much shorter time frame. And so the mobile industry is hungry for more spectrum. We'll put it to use very quickly, and we don't see the same demonstrated need for CBRS or Wi-Fi for that matter. Also note the data that Traci pointed to from NCTA shows that virtually all of the CBRS grants are for the highest power class available, right? People want higher powered spectrum. It's not that they want this low power spectrum. On 7-8 gigahertz, I think it's actually a really interesting conversation, right? And it ties into some of the discussion we had about 6 gigahertz, where I think it's increasingly looking like the U.S. went a little overboard, right, in allocating 1,200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed across the 6 gigahertz band, right? It makes us the largest allocation for unlicensed spectrum in the U.S. of any country, and I think it's indicating that we went overboard, right? We're not seeing very much adoption of 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi equipment, right? All the popular Wi-Fi 7 equipment is actually dual band. It's either using just 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. It's not actually seeing much adoption, mostly because it's not needed, right? Real world research shows that the 6 gigahertz spectrum made very little impact on the actual speeds that people are seeing over Wi-Fi. So I don't think we're seeing congestion or exhaust of that spectrum. In fact, very little of it is being used today. I think that we're seeing this reflected in the trends internationally, with Brazil reversing course, and as Traci mentioned, the UK in their examination of the 6 gigahertz band says that they're planning to dedicate 300 to 540 megahertz for high-powered licensed mobile spectrum. Right? That's we have 450 in the U.S. today. So with that motion alone, right, they'd have more spectrum, not counting all that they already have allocated. So I think there are a couple of different ways we could approach this issue. One that I think has obvious appeal is in that 7 to 8 gigahertz band, focus on full power licensed spectrum. And this would allow for the mobile industry to at least participate in the economies of scale where the rest of the globe is trending towards full power mobile spectrum in that upper portion of the 6 gigahertz band. We could tune equipment across from 6 gigahertz to 7 and 8 and participate in those economies of scale and gain some advantages that the rest of the world is having to have a harmonized spectrum policy. Thank you.
And then Traci,
Sarah, yeah, I know you said there was a question, but I have to jump in. So on 6 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz is widely used, certainly widely used as I know Doug is countering that, but just saying it doesn't make it true. And if you look at the way that Wi-Fi is actually used, especially we're looking at newer generations of Wi-Fi 6E and 7, Wi-Fi is using 320 megahertz channels and making available additional spectrum, and starting at the lower 7 gigahertz channel. 7 gigahertz will allow 4 full 320 megahertz channels, which is not only about speed. The speed is there. The need now is for low latency. We're seeing use cases like AR, VR, artificial intelligence, other uses that, and of course the medical use cases that require low latency and need those 320 megahertz channels. So Wi-Fi is not like other technologies that are always on. It's a polite technology. But it needs those large bandwidths to be able to offer consumers the types of reliable, low latency access to connectivity to be able to make use of the newer technologies and newer apps that we're seeing. And so I think that's important to note. And then as far as kind of looking globally, the U.S. is not afraid to be a leader. It's okay that the U.S. Is where we are on 6 gigahertz, and now we set an example for the rest of the world, an example that they can follow to see this is how it's done. UK is catching on. Brazil is backtracking now, but that doesn't say anything for the rest of the world. And also, that's not a final decision. There's still an opportunity, and we're still working hard to show the world that this is a good way and good use of spectrum. And also, it's key to look at the propagation characteristics as you're getting higher up and 6 and 7, 8 gigahertz. Who knows whether the types of deployments that Doug is talking about even work from a propagation perspective in those types of spectrum. And we know already that Wi-Fi use low power work, and not only work, but they share well with existing incumbencies and allow for quicker deployments and use of spectrum.
So, okay, so one final question before we wrap up, 5 more minutes. We have a question about fixed wireless access. So, in the home, we actually have wireless providers offering 5G fixed wireless. And like Doug said, there are more subscribers, there's demand for that. What does the panel think about just like creative destruction? Like you see some models winning out or like getting market share. How is that supposed to inform Congress or policymakers? It is tumultuous, they're different, technologies are going to get more share from other technologies. How are policymakers supposed to respond quickly or in due time? So maybe Christian or Michael, do you have thoughts? And then
Michael, you want to
go? Sure. Yeah, well, that's exactly why we need, a balanced spectrum policy with all the different, flavors of access, because, thanks to, I think more than anyone, what Chairman Pai did at the FCC in his tenure, where he made the 1,200, created this underlay of 1,200 additional megahertz of shared spectrum for unlicensed, auctioned the C-band, as well as the below CBRS, just made a lot more, and launched CBRS as well for shared. So that FCC put all 3 flavors out, and what we're seeing today is some of the fruits of that, which is reciprocal competition. So cable, right, is using a Wi-Fi. Cable, most people don't know this. Cable has, I think it's nearly 18 million mobile subscribers, because they're using a Wi-Fi first model where 90%, because typically you're indoors at work within range of a friendly Wi-Fi. So 90% of the mobile device data traffic is going over Wi-Fi, 10% that goes over Verizon, which is because they operate as mobile virtual network operators. Conversely, fixed wireless, because there hasn't been much of a market for, they really haven't seen any kind of new 5G apps that use bandwidth. The C-band and other spectrum that became available by auction is being used to compete with cable and other fixed line providers. So something on the order of 10 million fixed wireless subscribers by the mobile industry. So so as a consumer advocate, I really welcome that, but overall, since the mobile device data traffic is 90% indoors, we are just going to need all the unlicensed spectrum we have, and even more so.
I violently agree with Michael on everything he said, and I'd even complicate even further his picture of the cable technology mix. Cable companies actually have a number of licensed as well for some, in some areas. I think out west, I think Charter has some licensed holdings, so that they kind of are seamlessly blending this MVNO model with some of their own spectrum, with their own Wi-Fi networks, doing Wi-Fi first. So, and that's kind of like an example. And then you see, I believe Comcast has a relationship with Starlink, I think, or with one of the satellite operators, to provide that sort of that handoff kind of connectivity, or at least like the way T-Mobile is working with Starlink to do the text messaging thing. I was just opted into the beta right before this panel. So you're seeing this, you go back to what I said before, you're seeing this convergence of all these different kinds of technologies in the mix. I think fixed wireless is another important one. I first became aware of it, I don't know, sometime in the last decade, like as a real viable technology when I met rural providers out in Nebraska who were using fixed wireless to go out to communities that, again, had trouble with these closing digital divide issues. They had very slow connections out there, and they were able to stand up fixed wireless solutions for some communities at a very relatively low cost and provide a really reasonable amount of connectivity, latency, and throughput. So I think that fixed wireless is going to be an important part of that mix as well. And even going so far as to say that even in relatively more connected areas, I think having the opportunity to have another competitor come in who doesn't need to string wire or bury wire might have easier time with permitting, depending on what your siting permits are like. That's going to be an important part of the future. And everybody on this panel has mentioned it, but like things like AI, AR, VR, they're only going to increase the requirements for both wireless and unlicensed applications going forward. And we're going to need a lot more of both of those, which I realize is a super unsatisfying way to offer final thoughts on a panel of like, which one do we need more of? But we're going to have to figure out ways to build on the successes we had under Chairman Pai's tenure with Chairman Carr and really free up a lot more for both uses, in my opinion.
Great. Well, I think that's a good neutral spot to end. I mean, this debate's it keeps going. So I just want to say thank you to the panelists. Thanks for preparing these statistics for us. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you in other venues soon too. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.